Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are today. I'm Jerry Enderle, Editor-in-Chief of School Planning and Management and College Planning and Management magazines. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. This webinar is being presented by SchoolDude. Founded in 1999, SchoolDude has served as a market leader in education operations asset management. Now, 20 years later, the SchoolDude platform by Dude Solutions is the de facto standard in educational operations management across the U.S. and in Canada and other countries. While we're waiting for others to join us, let's go through a few housekeeping items. First, this event will be recorded and archived, and it will be available on demand. Second, please feel free to ask questions. On your screen is a Q&A box. Enter your questions, and DK will do his best to answer them at the end of this presentation or by email in the next few days. Finally, if you click on the resources icon on your screen, you can download a copy of this presentation and other materials that may be helpful to you. Today's webinar is titled the Second Annual Education Operations Health Index Webinar. Our speaker will be talking about the overall health of operations in the education sector based on responses to Dude Solutions' recent survey of 200 education leaders, data from Dude's 6,000 education clients, and the company's 17 years of experience in the education field. Our speaker is David Carnegie. Since 1998, David has worked predominantly in the operations management industry. Affectionately known as DK, the mayor, or walking library, his current role is community director, where he manages the SchoolDude and Dude Solutions community website and social media outlets with topics involving industry insight and knowledge sharing. It's DK's mission to understand and support Dude Solutions industries by accelerating their professional development, addressing their professional pains, and providing fun and inspiring information. So without further delay, I'm turning this presentation over to DK.
Thank you, everyone. Great afternoon, and hopefully good morning for everyone that's out there. Again, my name is David, but everyone calls me DK. So definitely when you have questions, definitely feel free to call me that. Our agenda for today, we'll go through a few welcome and introductions, a few items that are in the background of the people and the persons, the data and the insights and the subjectivity that goes behind what we call the Operational Health Index Report, or the OHI report. We'll also make sure to cover any areas where people may have questions, so definitely feel free to use the chat area in case you have any questions or thoughts or ideas. We definitely want to hear them. Background on the actual report itself. So from a data standpoint, we are the largest educational operations database that's out there. So you can see some of the statistics there on the screen, 7,000 educational institutions. And we define an institution as a college, a university, a district, an independent school. So you're talking about 2.5 million professionals, about 37 million students. Last year, we had just over 35.5 million work orders, 3 million IT help desk tickets, just under 9 million events for things such as after-hours facility use, community use, where people come in and use the facilities outside of the normal instructional routine. This is data that we've been basing for just about 20 years, ever since we started the whole database with the SchoolDude world. And we decided that data brought value. Many times people needed something to back up their thoughts, their experiences, their opinions. So we began looking at how we could make data consistent, how we could roll it up into very useful information. And then we said, people were asking us, well, you've got this information, what can we do with it? So many of us were being asked to provide guidance. The OHI is essentially a summary of that guidance. So how do we roll this up into easy, digestible, comprehensive key performance indicators, statistics, benchmarks? So giving you that idea of the background, what we also said was data is great, and many of us had personal interactions with people. But we also wanted to make sure we had that documented in a very easy-to-understand survey. So we had about 200 people that were educational leaders, that they were at director's positions, business officer positions, what we might call the C-level types of positions, that they understood where the data might go to guide a lot of the decisions. So pulling that out of our 6,000 educational client database, we began this in 2017 to put out a subjective survey to balance that with the objective survey. And we decided to focus on 6 specific areas that we'll talk about today. We scored that performance on a binary scale, and then we normalized the data, but we also included things like student size. How does that affect what the data is going to be interpreted as? And certainly because many people might be funded on a student count basis, we wanted that type of information to come in. So we're going to focus today with what the OHI really focuses on preventive maintenance, deferred maintenance, community or after-hours usage, technology, energy, safety. So we were mining that database, and when we first started, we were looking at where these things were going to come in. So about 49% of the folks that took the survey were K-12 public school districts. Just a little over a quarter, about 26%, were higher education, colleges, universities, community colleges. Just about 9% were private and independent schools, and 19% said, we don't really want to say who we are just yet. So, having a good, type of layering of how we were getting that information was something that we really felt was essential, because some of the things that affect higher education, you might see some similarities with independent and private schools, but you may not see that same similarity with public K-12. But there are certain things with energy conservation that might have some similarities that were out there. So being able to break that information down was something huge. And what we saw with a lot of the responses, we can tell you without a doubt that people are beginning to use data to make big changes, big choices in their institutions. So for example, Western Washington University, they really focused on data around their energy program, and a lot of their initiatives they were able to do with that were about 200 to 300 hours of work per year. So you're talking probably about, half a man, FTE-wise, that potentially could have been saved. Georgia College and State University, they cut their work order completion time down from days and weeks to just 24 hours. Moreno Valley Unified School District, they were able to get $675,000 in state funding thanks to data that was accurate from their work order system. So having that information there and being able to make decisions on that were huge. And the people that were behind the scenes, we had a person, again, to represent the objective data versus the subjective information. Melissa is our data analyst. She's been with us since 2015. She's been a data scientist for over 4 years. She's got a background in applied mathematics, and she's got a degree in analytics. So she can take the data side of it, be able to massage that data, being able to make that into a comprehensible type of format. And then Jed, he has experience from working with clients and personnel. He helps our clients understand that data. He understands the stories that people would talk about. When he looks at data, he may say, well, yes, this went up or this went down. These are the 3 or 4 factors that we need to consider with that. So he understands the experiences with that. So he was able to be one of our operations experts and pioneers from the other side of the brain of how we want to look at that information. So now let's get into some of the results, the scores, and the supporting indices and the supporting stories behind that. So the overall health, that was one thing that people really wanted to see, is a big overall statistic, a big overall number. So we were looking at it on a scale of 1 to 100, and the current one is at 57.2 out of that scale of 1 to 100. 1 basically is the most pessimistic outlook, and 100 being the most optimistic outlook, and it would be a complete perfect indicator of success from an operational standpoint. The sentiment for this year is not extremely optimistic, but it's really not negative either. It's kind of in the middle when we look at the overall indicators across all the trends that were out there, but it was a slight increase from our previous score of 55.6 in 2017. So when we start getting into where these breakdowns are, we color-coded them with positive, neutral, and negative, with green being the positive. So here are the different indices that went into our composite score. Every white box basically, yellow box is neutral. We're kind of at that caution light. Are we going to hit the gas or are we going to hit the brake? And when we start getting into the specifics behind these sentiments, something that we really want to look at and we found was interesting were things that were positive were actually things that were external factors. Things like energy, you're dealing with utility companies, you're dealing with gas companies, you're dealing with vendors that might be providing things like recycling services. Community use, you're dealing with third parties, you're dealing with external organizations. It might be a nonprofit in the area, it might be a faith-based organization in the area. And things that you would think would be in your control are actually things that were either neutral or negative. And they actually brought the score down. So you would think things like deferred maintenance, things like Internet of Things, preventive maintenance, getting into predictive maintenance, you would think that's something that you should have control over, but that's not necessarily the case. And it may not always necessarily be the focus of what people are looking at. So there's a slight disconnect in maybe how these things are being pushed forward. Energy is a very popular topic. When you're talking about community use, that's very prevalent in how you're working with these outside organizations. There's a PR standpoint to it. So those things might get attention. Now, they didn't always get that attention in the past, but they certainly have a lot of that attention now. We may start seeing some things shift in the near future, but currently where we are at this state of the game is that's where things seem to be focused on. If it's something that is making the news, local or national, there's definitely an attention span that goes towards that. But when we're talking about things like deferred maintenance, is that a disconnect somewhere that it's not getting the resources or it's not getting the attention or it's being denied that for whatever reason? So things you would think are in your control are actually not things that are showing in positive outlooks right now. So we'll begin first with what I call the no-brainer, you would think, preventive maintenance. Everybody understands the whole, a stitch at 9 saves time, and I need to change the oil on my car on a regular basis. So right now, about a little over 56% of us were saying we're doing the same amount of preventive maintenance we did last year. That means about 43.3% of us are doing less preventive measures than we did in the previous year of 2016 and 2017. Again, the reason I call this a no-brainer is a lot of times our facilities are getting old. They're getting wear and tear every year. Every year it gets a little more problematic to think of preventive maintenance as a nice-to-have, and it starts becoming a must. And so that's where a lot of the focuses are being put is we must do this. Our roofs are getting older, or they're such a part of our business continuity plan, much less from a health and safety standpoint. We have to put the focuses on these major items, and we have these mandates we have to follow, like inspecting basketball goals. That might be a prerequisite in certain states that has to be done. It has to be turned into the state. So putting a lot of focus on preventive maintenance, we definitely look at what are the business essentials that we have to do and the safety and security essentials that we have to do. But what we may see is that, people may not think of the facilities beyond the operational standpoint. Because what a lot of people are realizing is they'll tie in things like preventive maintenance and the environment of the facility into things such as student performance. But you also have to think that these students are in your facilities so many hours during a week. It's easy to think of the frontline responsibility as instructional, maybe a nurturing environment. The backside is you're providing that safe, comfortable, well-functioning environment. That's got to happen. We can't do that when these buildings and these assets are pushed to the limit. The rooms start going down. The labs don't operate. Systems are failing. If I have dorms, what are the students going to be doing in those dorms or residential areas at an independent school or a college? What happens when we start losing those items? We say it's business continuity because it may not be in the traditional aspect that if my company was closed for the day, we lose X amount of dollars in productivity. Those numbers, or concept-wise, can also be applied to an educational institution. That's instructional time that's being lost. We're going to have to make up that time. Either what's going to be a half day is now going to be a full day. Now we've got to bus kids in on a Saturday, and the parents get upset. Those things are part of your business continuity plan. And if you're maintaining your assets, you're going to reduce that risk of failure. Will you stop failure? Not necessarily. Will you reduce it? Absolutely. Having a strong PM program means about a little to half to two-thirds reduction in the amount of emergencies that you have to deal with. And you're talking also anywhere from almost a 29% to just over a 39% reduction in cost. So that's where the stitch in time saves 9 is that dollar that you invest now will save you $3 to $4 down the road. Is it easy to define? No. Insurance companies have defined that because we've seen a 1 in 4 from some of the insurance companies out there that if that piece of equipment failed, now we've got to put in additional costs to replace that piece of equipment. So we also look at some of our clients, and Curtis is someone that I consider a really good friend that he's in my inner circle. If I need to sanity check something, he's one of my go-to people. He's very, very well adept at IFMA. He's been certified as a facility manager through IFMA. So we wanted to make sure we had a good quote that talked about how his preventive measures really started to make an impact. And he's fortunately enough surrounded by 2 guys and a whole team, but 2 guys in particular that are also really good with data, and they understand what that data is supposed to be used for in making those arguments and making those cases and getting people to think about what an investment will produce and where we're going to be down the road. So what Curtis was saying is by investing those resources into preventive maintenance, he's able to get equipment go beyond its standard life expectancy. And because of that, they're getting less reactive work orders that are coming in because they put such a focus on maintaining what they have. Now back to the global scale, year over year, the ratio of preventive maintenance to non-preventive maintenance has stayed about the same. It's about 19% over the last couple of years. And we want to see people try to strive for improvement and try to get to a recommended benchmark of maybe 30%. I've heard people say a perfect world, we're doing 80 to 90%. I can tell you I've only seen 2 or 3 people do that in almost 20 years. It's possible, but it's not realistic for everyone. So if you can shoot for about a 30% type of number, how much is preventive versus reactive, I definitely recommend doing that. And some of the things may be simple. Just go look at it. The door hardware is something we're seeing a constant problem with. Just go look at it on a routine basis. You might be able to front load that issue before it becomes a bigger issue, more costlier issue, a safety issue. So being able to just say, keep it simple. I don't need a 2-page task list, especially if my team knows what they're doing. Just go look at it. And then start trying to focus on showing where those wins are, that we now have less door hardware issues we're dealing with. We have seen a drop-off in the reactive work that's out there. And so being able to dedicate resources, we've seen a drop-off in people adding resources dedicated to preventive maintenance. I know some people try to shift to say, well, maybe if we had a second shift that was focusing on preventive maintenance or not being distracted during the day, try to think of ideas like that. But again, keep it simple. Is what are things we have to do from a health and safety and operational standpoint to keep everybody warm and functional and feel like they're in a good learning environment, and then start tackling the things that you know are causing problems with your staff. They're causing all these fires to erupt. They can't get into a cadence or a routine. So we definitely want to see where people can start increasing their ratio of preventive maintenance versus reactive and try to get into how they can reduce their backlog and their deferred work. So speaking of deferred work, that is one of the areas that causes a lot of people of concern. So there is still a negative outlook that is happening out there. We have seen that deferred maintenance and overdue capital needs, it's a very concerning trend I've been seeing for 20 years, but we're now getting more concrete numbers on a more routine basis. We're seeing that the average life of educational facilities is still above 40 years. It used to be 46, I would say, maybe 10 years ago, but it's still above 40 years. Yes, we've had a lot of new construction. There have been renovations, but we still have a massive amount of assets that are out there greater than 40 years old. And also, really, it did not speak well that many of the respondents said that their board members have a neutral or middling support of capital improvements for the existing buildings. On a scale of 1 to 3, the likelihood that upgrades would happen would be probably about a 3. I know from talking with people personally, they'll say, well, it's a lot easier to get someone to build a new building than it is to retrofit or update or upgrade or uplift or being able to just renovate an existing building. There's a little more sizzle behind the new facility versus uplifts to the existing facility. So I know mentally that's where some people may say that's where we might see some difficulty. The percentage of funding that's typically set aside for deferred maintenance and capital improvement, that did not have a positive indicator as well. Probably the recommended percentage of budget set aside for deferred maintenance and capital is around 3% of the building's value on an annual basis. About 19% of the people that were surveyed allocated a portion of that size, about 3%, and 42.5% of people allocated less than 3% down to 0%. That number, unfortunately, has increased from 15% in 2017 up to 19% this time around. So that number is still just really dismally low. Another worrying standpoint, about 38% of people are not sure how much they have set aside for anything that's overdue, any capital needs that may be out there, as well as the backlog. And it's not just us that's been talking about that. So originally when we were looking at numbers, probably about 10 years ago, we would see roughly certain numbers that have been out there. We've also worked with people or talked with people that are in these other organizations that are very familiar with what the need is and where the numbers are. So groups like the 21st Century School Fund, the Society of Engineers, they put out these reports on a more consistent basis now versus when it used to be every 5, 10, and 20 years. Now it's becoming more of an annual to biannual update. So overdue needs have gone up 18% in the last 5 years. Now, translating that over to dollars, that's about $6,400, almost $6,500 per student. Years ago, that was $5,000 per student. So that number has definitely gone up. Inflation aside, that number has gone up. And put it into total dollars, that's just over $500 million in deferred maintenance in American schools alone. So that is something that we see is we need to look at how we can systematically, across the board, systematically reduce the accumulation of deferred maintenance in the state so that they can maybe bump up maybe 1 extra % of the current replacement value per year to start pulling this information and pull these totals down, because these buildings can't go the way they're going. There has to be some kind of a shift that happens, because that number is only going to get worse as it already has been getting worse. We need to make sure that buildings don't run to fail. Now, I have talked to people personally over the years that they'll say, well, the only way I can get funded is to let it fail. That's a sad state of affairs. That is something that should not happen. You should not be penalized for keeping something running as long as it can and only get the solution when there is no other choice. But that is the unfortunate state that brings people into that negativity pattern of what's happening with deferred maintenance. Now, we actually see that there is a difference in private and independent schools and higher education. The reason being, students have a choice, typically, of what institution they go to. Years ago, APA had a great statistic. 64% of students, the main reason they went there, that they chose that college, was because of the condition of the campus. Private and independent schools, you have parents that are investing money in that. Yes, they have a choice to send their child somewhere. They pick that school. They're putting money into it. That school is competitive either with other independent schools and definitely competitive with the public schools. So they want to make sure that there's a bang for the buck, that there's a clean, safe, optimal environment, that the parents feel like, yes, I am feeling like my money is going towards something. And I was at a conference yesterday, and there were people saying we don't market our district enough. You know, we just assume that we're part of the community. We don't really talk about ourselves unless it's this sort of situation that comes up, you know, weather pattern, or we need a new bond, or we have this situation we're dealing with. They don't market themselves the way that a university or independent school would, but some of them are recognizing they may have to do that because they want to attract new revenue coming into their county or to their city, and those tax dollars will go back into funding the district. That is an investment. It's just simply a different input, but the same output. So being able to recognize that there are choices and that investments can go into deferred maintenance to help secure a choice for that child to attend and keep that child there, and also to keep good talent in your facilities. People like to go to a place where they like to feel comfortable in a good environment. If I'm going to a place where I feel uncomfortable, unsafe, unsanitary, unhealthy, I'm probably not wanting to stay there for my career. But having a place where I feel like I am doing the best I can with what I have and I'm not feeling uncomfortable about it, people want a positive working environment. It doesn't have to be glitz and gloss, but it does have to be a place that people feel like, yes, this is a good place for me to be. So now shifting gears into what the past was with deferred maintenance and the need to tackle that, what about things that are in the future? Things where we're looking at technology and different techniques to start getting ahead of the curve and reducing where some of our reactive work is going, so maybe we can dedicate it towards deferred maintenance. So preventive maintenance is having a routine. You're getting ahead of things. You're trying to prevent something before it breaks down. Typically, that might be based upon, well, we change filters every 3 months. We change belts every certain number of days and weeks and months. But when it comes to changing belts, maybe it could be something that could be analyzed by a piece of equipment using something like building controls or other types of sensors. The big buzzword you'll hear is Internet of Things. But what it's doing is saying, instead of me changing something on a time basis, let me change it when it needs to be changed, or alert me that something is happening and we need to get there before it is an issue. IBM had a great Watson commercial a few months ago where the elevator told the maintenance person it was about to break down. People in the building had no idea what was going on, but the maintenance guy knew because Watson told him that the elevator was showing a pattern that it was about to go down, and he went out to go fix it. That's where predictive maintenance really starts to come in, is saying let's get ahead of the issue and reduce the impact that may be out there. IoT, to me, it's a new way of describing an expansion of something that was already there. Many people have building automation, building management systems. They've had controls for a few decades. I know my previous occupation, I was managing a project where we were upgrading the Metasys system. I was working with Johnson Controls on that. We had a Cognizant pneumatic system on a military base, and we were switching that out with a new digital system, digital controls, tying it into a central panel. So the concept-wise, when you break it down to the core, that IoT is about a network of devices. It's equipment. It's going to have software on it, definitely going to have sensors in most cases. It might even have controllers. Conceptually, this has been around for a while. But what it's doing now is it's expanding into other areas and using it with not just tied in on a network, because what we would typically see in controls is they're somehow plugged into the network system of the facility. But now it's getting more into actually using the cloud, using internet, using wireless to communicate all these devices together into one cohesive unit. So the way that helps a lot of the schools and universities, conceptually it's been around for things like HVAC for a while. But where it really started getting tested a few decades ago were something simple like a vending machine lets you know that it's running out of Pepsi. It might give an alert saying we need to restock this machine. Certainly we've seen where sensors have been around on fridges and freezers for a long time, but maybe we start seeing something related to temperature on the dishwasher or some patterns that may be related to it. Again, trying to get that pulled into one comprehensive unit. Certainly a lot of what's on the devices and network may not always be applicable to educational facilities, but there are certain things that will be out there. I was visiting a facility a few months ago, and they had sensors in the ceilings. One of the things that the sensor could do was look at space utilization. So if people were in rooms that were designed for 16 people, but it was consistently holding 4 people, that meant that space could be utilized for something completely different. So we will see where space utilization will come up as a topic, and Internet of Things is starting to say, well, instead of us guesstimating this or trying to run some kind of a complex pattern, could we have a sensor, either a temporary sensor or a permanent sensor, start gathering information for us? And predictive maintenance has also been around for a while with things like the building automation systems, that it can measure things like vibration. So again, instead of doing this every certain number of months, let's do it whenever a certain alarm has come up. And it's different than a lot of the building automation systems that you would get, let's say, 100 alarms. Well, maybe only 7 of them matter. So conceptually, something we've talked about as a dude for years are things like critical alarms, not just give me data, an alarm for the sense of data, but what actually matters. But why this is coming up now, this year, 8.5 billion objects and devices are online IoT capable right now. That is 31% over the next few years. So being able to look over the next few years, what's going to happen is in 2020, there may be 30 billion devices, objects, and assets that are on the Internet of Things. Now, if the Internet goes down, well, that's one of the things that is one of the drawbacks. So that was one of the questions that was coming across is what if the Internet goes down? Certainly, that is always a concern. And many people, they've always liked the pneumatic systems because they felt like they always had that safety net there. You're going to have risk in pretty much any piece of asset, equipment, whatever it may be. If the Internet is down, hopefully it's just only for a few minutes. But that's one of the things that when you have any type of technology, there are going to be some drawbacks that happen to it. Now, we also wanted to get a sense of what familiarity people had with it, and I wonder also, was it a matter of the terminology that people were just getting into it? But just over half, about 58.5% of the folks that were surveyed, they were unfamiliar with the concept of PDM or predictive maintenance. And just about 85 to 86% said they're not currently using Internet of Things. If I was interpreting that question, I might ask about, are you including building automation controls in that, or strictly some of the things that I might be able to buy from a vendor like a Nest thermostat? What would we want to define as using IoT capabilities? But there are people, about 1 out of 5 or 20%, they do plan on using Internet of Things capabilities in the near future. So starting to think about where that's going to go. So we've got a poll here, and what we want to understand is, what do you think is holding you back from expanding into a lot of the devices? Is it a matter of it's not really something that we're interested in? We don't have the funding for it. It could be a lot of these things. We don't maybe know enough about it. How could we use it? Where would we use it? In what capacity would it be beneficial for us? And also, we don't really have a good business need defined for it. Maybe we don't understand how we could develop a business need for it, how to develop an ROI, because certainly you have to think about things like with Internet of Things and any type of technology, what are the pros and cons of how do I install it, maintain it, secure it, but then I also have to think executively, what benefit am I going to see out of it? Is it going to save me time and cost down the road? Is it going to make people in my buildings happier? Is it going to make my workforce happier? And they're able to get more things done. So trying to develop an ROI and a VOI of what the value of that investment would be and the return on that investment may be, that's what we would define as a business need. So I'm going to leave this up for about another 10 seconds just to give people a chance to get their answers submitted. And then we'll move on to the next slide. So let people do that. All right. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to push out the results for everyone. So budget, that's not a shocker. For a lot of people, it is trying to set aside what those resources are going to be. But again, a lack of knowledge. That is one of the things that I was not surprised by. It's a matter of, for me, I had to reframe my thought on what that meant. But again, it could be a case of, well, how do you actually implement that in the workplace and in the facilities? So let's start now talking about with a continuation of facilities. I mentioned a moment ago things like space utilization. Space utilization also is about community use. So it's not just when you're using it during instructional time, it's the after hours that is happening as well. Because what is happening is you are basically running facilities more than just from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. if I was a K-12. You know, we've got nights and weekends. Higher ed, you've definitely got events that are happening as well. There are things that there could be faculty functions. Certainly there's student organizations that are happening. Everybody might have these third-party groups, community groups that are coming in to use facilities. But you're looking at about, the average educational institution is about 790.3 hours of events on nights, after hours, evenings, weekends. So basically you're running 9 to 5 on a good day. I know there's a lot of people that are running from 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night because they may not know who's in the facility. They need to leave the systems running and so on. And again, because we wanted to break things down in a cost per student, we looked at how we break it down into cost per student per event, and that is $70. And we're talking about $70. You're talking about utilities, energy, paper products, custodians setting up, cleaning up, not just the event itself, but the restrooms. You've got toilet paper, paper towels, you've got soap, you've got to monitor those areas. Sometimes it's the custodian monitoring the event. Sometimes you actually have a security officer who's monitoring the event. You've got IT that might be bringing in AV carts and other types of audiovisual equipment. And then you're going to have some wear and tear that's going to happen to the building. But fortunately, we did not see as many people as you might think saw a high deterioration of their facilities from the use of the facilities as far as the community use. So 16.6% said they did see high deterioration, but 48.1% only saw a little bit, and 35.5% saw little to no deterioration. So when you're looking at wear and tear on the buildings, probably about, a third of the groups, and a third of the usages, you might see some minor stuff, but most people are saying, it's really not that bad. It's not much more than normal than what we might see during a typical operational day. And it's clear, though, after hours use of facilities, it does accelerate facility and equipment deterioration because there's just people there. Those systems are running. And what some people may do is they may say, well, let's only allow that in certain parts of the building. This zone we're going to keep running, that's where we want the highest concentration of facility use. We've got portables or a separate building or on its own split system. Let's put people in those areas first before trying to fire up an entire zone of the school itself or of the instructional building itself. Also, what we wanted people to focus on was the concept of cost recovery. When we want to recoup some of those $70 per student per event back, what we want to look at is many people we talk to, they said what's happening is I'm being pulled out of this, monies are being pulled out of this one budget, and we don't recover enough, and when we do, it might go into the general ledger or the general fund. So we want people to say it's not a matter of trying to make money, but it is trying to recoup some of the money and then put it back where it should be going back. Do you need to have a separate budget, a separate fund? Is it something that's going to go back to the point of origin of where those things are? Maybe not necessarily a chargeback situation, but it could be something that's helpful in that aspect. So what we're looking at is trying to say, well, let's make sure we understand the cost behind that $70 per student per year with things like energy and administrative time and recovery. So being able to say, let's slow the deterioration of facilities, but let's also slow the deterioration of our fund being pulled away from us. Try to put those dollars back into the facilities and back into the budgets. So we're looking that the average institution is probably about $19 per student as far as what's being recovered back. The top 20%, they're pulling back $27 per student in cost recovery. And what we did is we took a sampling of a lot of our clients with organizations that had less than 150 students all the way up to 175,000 students. But that's the other reason why we did size of the student count, so that way we had a good spectrum across the board. And we also saw that with 5,000 students, on average, you can recover about $76,000 per year. But if you've got a really diligent program, it gets into $165,000 per year. So what is a diligent program? It means, A, you're paying attention to it. You're making sure that any policies, any prices are updated. You've also got the processes of how people can approve things, and who you do charge and who you don't charge has been approved, and what their processes are. Also making sure you've got rankings set up as what groups are allowed in what areas first. Education, you may say, well, if it's curricular, that comes first. Anything extracurricular has to come second. Being consistent, consistently checking in, consistently following up those groups, consistently making sure we get paid. Also, trending and KPIs. Have we seen any changes that have happened over time? But the number one thing is having a champion, a person who says, I got this. I'm going to make sure things do not fall through the cracks. So when you start getting into the larger institutions, and again, you can probably break it down on a per student basis. So 35,000 students, you're talking just under a $500,000 a year. But if you've got a good set of processes, a good champion in place, and you're following up, you're talking just about $765,000 per year. So getting into technology, because that is one of the areas people may not think about when they're using facilities, is we're using technology. A lot of times people are connecting to our networks, or using our audiovisual equipment. They're going to use our projectors and so on. So technology is one of the areas that we're seeing some shifts on, but not enough. It's very still neutral compared to what it was a year ago, and then working with groups like COSA and what they've seen over time. So probably not a shock, but now you've got numbers behind it, is where the concern is over things like student data, the security of the student data. So we're talking about just over 2/3 of everyone says it's more important than it was before, and then another third said it's much more important where it was before. And I would say if you're shocked by 0% said it's less important, then that's a number you've got too. 0% of the IT professionals said student data is less important than it has been in the past year. So that is one of the things that we want to make sure people have numbers behind, is there is a major concern around student data. Many people may focus on assets, and certainly that is a concern, that there's having enough people and enough tools to manage the new assets that are coming in. We're switching away from books to digital. We're full swing on that. But also because we've got cybersecurity threats where people might be trying to hack into a school network and get student data and essentially hold data hostage. That's something that's been a big concern for people, in addition to optimizing the learning environment, making sure we've got the tools to support the digital classrooms of today. So trying to spend time on the security and the assets is still a major concern, and 58.48% said they've got more assets to deploy compared to last year, and that's been a pretty consistent trend across the board. 60% of the time, they are spending time reacting to technical issues. And again, that's what's detracting them away from managing assets, is they're having to deal with issues. It could be a user issue, it could be a truly technical issue. But getting the staffing in place is something that's really hard for people, because there's so much competition for good technology talent. So trying to find people to fill those spots, in addition to just having the budget to have the tools in place as well as the people in place, those are still challenges that are out there. So the budget constraints is not limited to just one department, but understanding where those tools and where those problems are, and then allocating the proper resources and budget to it is still very essential. Now, energy is positive because there's been so much attention put on energy in the last few decades that it's a good PR. A lot of the students that have been coming up in the last couple of generations, they've been having that focus on clean air and conservation and energy conservation and water conservation. So there's definitely a generational push that's been happening, and also a business push that we're saving money whenever we do it at the same time. It's not just, golly, we feel good, but golly, we're saving money too. And we've seen that 70% of people said that they have not seen an increase in energy spend. Actually, the energy spend is going down. But it's still the second most major expense in an operational budget, the first one being people. The second one is typically energy from an operational standpoint. But when you've got groups like Energy Star, you've got some of the utilities and the local governments that are working on programs and subsidies and awards that if people can really push the energy conservation aspect of it, they get some good press around it and some good feel-good around it and some pride around it. Most people, though, they had not seen an increase, and they had actually seen that down from 83%, I think is what the number was. Yes, it was 83% last year to 70% this year, but still the sentiment is positive that these savings are coming in. In some cases, utility companies may be lowering costs, but many of them are providing initiatives and programs, and many people are getting into some of the control systems and the miser programs and LED lights and uplift lighting systems and other types of major energy systems, retro commissioning, retrofits that are happening. So we've seen that decrease happen over time, but there still is room for improvement. And one of the first ones is actually knowing what you're spending, paying attention to it. So I was saying earlier with community use is actually paying attention to it and understanding what's happening. Energy is much in that same way. So we'll see energy spend and usage decrease as more people are tracking their energy consumption. They might be just looking at the bills. It might be using smart metering. But being able to assess what's happening, especially on your utility costs, your utility consumptions, where those are, and then start looking at where those anomalies may be. It could be a case with a water spike. Well, maybe there's an issue with the irrigation system. If it's a case of heating, is it a usage issue where someone is keeping the windows open and they're not supposed to? But having some sense of what's out there is huge. So Mark with Trumbull School, Public Schools, what they did is they set up their plan to turn their energy spending around, and they set that up in 2014. So since then, they've saved $864,000. They've got 3 retro commissioning projects done. They've upgraded 9 boiler rooms. They installed 4 solar arrays, and they put a new roof on a middle school. So being able to put those dollars into something tangible was something that Mark was able to do at their schools. So let's close out with safety. And again, that's one of those areas that got neutral. And it's probably not a shock, but at least it's not something depressing overall. But unfortunately, there are some things that people are very concerned about. So almost 100%, 95.76% said they feel the same or they're more concerned about safety this year versus last year. So we know this is the utmost priority outside of outside of curriculum and instructional. This is the utmost priority. This is way up in the food chain for where people are putting their focuses on. So the U.S. Department of Education, they said that school-aged youths, especially in including higher education, the college students, they're more likely to be victims of a violent crime than any other age that they're at or any other age group. But when I was first getting introduced to this topic a few years ago, it wasn't just about violent crimes. It was also about the effects of what's happening. It's also getting into things such as not just school violence that's causing negative behavior, but drug and alcohol use, psychological problems, depression, anxiety, especially with kids that are switching from school to college. I mean, middle school is always difficult. High school, you have an adjustment. College, you have a big adjustment. So there's things that happen on a psychological standpoint, not just a violent standpoint, that affects campus safety and being able to have that safe environment that people feel like they're a part of. So a lot of the people, they were saying that their budgets, though, have stayed the same since last year. They feel positive about the efforts that they put in, but there is a concern that the budget is still not quite where it needs to be. So 52.3%. They said they feel more concerned than they did the previous year. 43.46%, they feel the same level of concern. Only 4.2% of people said they feel less concern than they had previously. And again, it's probably not a shock, but when you have the numbers behind that only 4% of people feel better about safety, that's one of the areas that is, kind of an indicator. And we have a phrase here, when you listen to the whispers, hopefully you won't have to hear the screams, and that is one of the whispers that people should be listening at is if only 4% of people feel less concerned, then that may be something we need to put an extra eye on. So in closing, bringing us back around, the positive outlooks have been managing external factors. The things that have been neutral and especially negative are things that people want to feel like they've got control over, but they don't have control over. Something is affecting what they feel like they should have a control over, things like a backlog and deferred maintenance and safety and so on. Those things they feel like they should be able to control, but they can't for whatever reason. They don't have buy-in from a board. They don't have the resources. They don't have the skill, the personnel, or the resources. And sometimes, for many people, it's a combination of all the above. It's the perfect storm that the unlimited need meets the limited resources, and they have to battle with what they have to battle. But what we do want to say is that things are a little better than they were last year. We still want to see that number go up. I mean, certainly we know a 100 is not going to happen. It's just no way, no how. That is not realistic. What we want to do is say this number can drive conversations that can spur a positive change. The whole sense of the butterfly effect, the flap of a butterfly's wings can cause a typhoon around the world. So if we can do things like this to get people thinking and talking and really exploring what goes behind that number, where is the real story of why we're at that place, that's our big ultimate goal of the Operational Health Index. So what I want to do is turn it over to our moderators and see any questions that we may have. And we're going to have a poll while that's coming up. So we'll have the poll and let that pull up for everyone. So I'm going to give our moderators a chance to take a look at some of the questions, and we'll go from there. So.
Okay, thank you. First question we have is, what do you think holds people back from IoT? Budget, knowledge, or something else?
I wonder if it's just as much about knowledge, because for me it's a case of, well, some of this type conceptually has been around for a while. Conceptually people have it, but maybe it's just really understanding where it can be used, how it can be used, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff and say, well, this type of information is good and this other type of information is just a distraction. I think really understanding where that's coming in and how it can be applied, and then maybe where to start. There's a lot of things when it comes to knowledge that you have to think about with any type of new initiative is, kind of thinking above the line and below the line. Thinking below the line is the technical. Thinking above the line is the business and the practical way of trying to approach it. So you've got two sets of knowledge there. Does it fit a business need? And then can we implement, maintain, and use it once we've got it into place? And some of those you may have to take on a case-by-case basis. But I think knowledge and understanding is really going into it first, to say, okay, I'm going to talk to someone who is an expert in that field or expert on that piece of equipment and see, is that something that really is going to matter to us?
Okay. What was the biggest contributor to the higher comprehensive score this year? Were multiple areas trending more positively, or was there one strong area that brought up the score?
Energy was definitely a big factor in that. Just seeing where things like the conservation programs, sustainability programs where students would get involved, higher ed, you would see things like the President's Commitment to Climate Change initiative that's been going on the last few years, and that still gained momentum because those programs are still in place. Having, even custodians involved with the students, a lot of those things have really gained ground. And you would see a lot of cases where the president's office or the chancellor's office or the superintendent's office, they had that as a mandate, and they made sure that mandate was carried through, and the support of the facilities and the operational personnel to make sure that mandate came through and do what it took to put those changes in. But then you also had the utility companies kicking in as well, because they understood that it's good for them to be able to put in these energy programs. So like our utility company, they're really big about, we can get you incentives on LED bulbs. So they try to do things to push a lot of this information through. And being able to see that was a big positive trend. But also the community use side really brought it up just because we've seen a lot of awareness on it. People had just finally said, we've had enough of this, and then, being able to be armed with information to say we need to make a change. And we would see that these little bubbles around the country over the last few years pop up where people would band together and say, what are you guys charging? How did you do it? What process did you have for this? Switching away from paper invoices where we were losing 10%, 20%, and switching over to electronics and going into processing. So those things have gained ground over the years, and they've had that flywheel effect as well. Deferred maintenance is what starts bringing it down, so it's a negative flywheel effect. But seeing some of the positives where the energy programs really start bringing that number up for people.
Lisa would like to know if having event essentials or another program would help to maximize recouping events for facility rental.
Yes. So where that comes into play from a product standpoint is being able to say, this is what we charge, this is where we charge it, and this is who we charge it to. So being able to say, well, if we are going to charge people to come into our facilities, what would be my hourly rate for a custodian? How many custodians per hour? But I might have a different rate for a nonprofit. It might be a no charge or a limited charge. And if it's an internal group, it's a no charge. If it's a company, a for-profit company in my community, it's a full charge. So being able to coordinate those events to say this is either a flat rate or an hourly rate, what tier of a rate are we going to put, like a full rate or a half rate or a no rate? Then being able to say, okay, let's make sure that we've got all the dates and the times involved in that, generate an invoice, being able to say, here, group, be able to look at that, make sure you can pay it. We now work with groups where they can pay online. So groups like My School Bucks we integrate with so they can do online payments for those events. And then being able to see, okay, is this 90 days past due or 30 days past due? How much do they still owe us? And that's really where a lot of the processes were coming in and where it was being lost in the paper world was, looking at event management is a complex beast. And when you have something that falls through the cracks that could eventually affect the bottom line of what you're trying to recover, that's where a lot of attention is. And we've really tried to focus a lot of our processes around trying to seal up what does it take, when is it going to be, where is it going to be, who's going to be there, how much do we charge, and have we been recouped for those expenses?
One last question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a report in Maintenance Direct that can show the percent of reactive versus preventive maintenance that is being done?
Yeah, so that gets into our preventive maintenance scheduler, and certainly there's a couple of other ones, we would call a purpose report. It would say if a work order is preventive maintenance, or just a work order in general, you can identify why. Why is that? Why are we doing that job? Is it preventive? Is it vandalism? Is it normal wear and tear? Was it accidental damage? So you can categorize why that job is there and run a report, just a quick level summary report that will say 30% of our work is preventive, and then the other categories might be 10% vandalism and so on. But, of course, you can always run those reports to Excel and group them in different ways, but we certainly show that percentage right on a simple, what we call a purpose summary report. But there's also a more detailed report in our preventive maintenance scheduler that you can go down asset by asset and say, on this boiler number 2 at Lincoln, this is how much time and percentage-wise we've spent on reactive versus preventive. But I always say start with a purpose report that just summarizes what percentage are we spending on preventive versus other categories. And before I step off that soapbox, I hate the term general maintenance. I'm fine with the term preventive maintenance, but I'm not a fan of the term general maintenance because it really doesn't identify why we did the job. It basically is my equivalent of saying we did stuff. We didn't really say why we did it. Was it a case of user error, equipment failure, damage? Being able to identify why, to me, is very important in a report like preventive and percentages.
Okay, well, we're out of time. So once again, I would like to thank our speaker, David Carnegie, Dude Solutions for presenting this webinar, and all of you for attending. Thank you, and have a great rest of your